All right. Thank you all for joining us for this session entitled The Narrative Impact of a Famous Storm, an interview with novelist Kim Garza. We're really happy that you could be with us today as part of the 1455 Summer Festival. This is our 4th annual festival this year, hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. I'm Jessie Lewis. I'm a writer, a poet and essayist and teacher, and I'm really excited to be on the 1455 board and to welcome Kim Garza. So welcome, Kim.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to join you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And this is, I guess, for appearing in this digital landscape, which kind of makes it fantastic because I'm in Virginia. And where are you?
I'm in San Antonio, Texas.
There we go. So it's nice. It's nice to make this connection. So just so that everybody gets introduced to Kim, Dr. Kimberly Garza is an assistant professor of creative writing and literature, working primarily in fiction and nonfiction. She received a PhD in English creative writing, specializing in fiction and in Mexican American literature from the University of North Texas. She is the author of The Last Karankawas, a forthcoming novel and story centering on Galveston Island and Hurricane Ike. From Henry Holt and Company. Her stories and essays have been published in some fantastic places like Copper Nickel, Diagram, Triquarterly, Creative Nonfiction, Cut Bank, Bennington Review, and her 2018 essay, The Queen's Signal, was nominated for a pushcart. And now she serves as associate editor for The Boilers. So this is awesome. Kim's an exciting up and coming voice, and I'm so excited to have her here. I met her a little bit ago, pre-pandemic land, and so it's really great to see her face. So
it feels so long ago.
It does. It really does.
And that's time ago.
Time just has no definition now, is what it is.
Doesn't.
All right. So I want to hop right into talking about Kim's novel. So it is coming out in August. Is that correct?
Yes, August 9th.
Nice. So this is the time to pre-order, and authors love a good pre-order. And if you are interested in a novel, you should always pre-order because that is super, super helpful for reprinting, especially in our time period when printing books is a little bit trickier. So yeah, so early requests are great. But it's also really important because Kim's novel is so important right now and so prominent in culture and what we should be thinking about. And that's why I'm so excited to interview her. So I'm going to start us off just with a quick little reading from the top of Kim's novel so you can get a feeling for it. I love the specificity of place and culture in this work. And so that's why I'm just tackling that very first sentence. It starts, in the parking lot of Sacred Heart Catholic Church in the cool dusk, which is a lie already because it is never really cool, not even on this January evening, since this is Texas, and more specifically, this is Galveston. We wait. Like, talk about like dropping us right in. Like that's awesome as a first sentence. I love it. I'm jealous of that first sentence as a writer. So Kim, tell us about why you chose Galveston and the surrounding locations here and what's important about this area for you.
It's really important to me. Galveston has a personal connection. I tend to begin writing from place, from setting. That just speaks most to me. It's the easiest kind of access point. And at the time that I wrote what would end up being the title chapter of this story, of this book, I just come back from a visit to visit family in Galveston. That's where I was born. It's where a lot of my mom's family, when they immigrated from the Philippines, they all kind of settled there. So that's where my cousins lived, my grandparents. And yeah, and I find of all the places that I've lived and that I love, Galveston is one of the more fascinating ones because of a lot of external reasons that are, some are horrible and some are really cool. And it just has this really rich and varied history. And it's such a small piece of land. It's like, I think it's something like 3 miles wide, like it's this tiny strip of land that has such such personality to it. And I loved the idea of just working with a place like that from the beginning, because there's very little me as a fiction writer, like very little I have to do. It's already there. And the characters are composites and of people I knew or of roles and types of people that I grew up with and I experienced and people that I've invented. And again, there's very little work to do with something as fascinating as a place like this that has all of this built-in, interest in character. And what I wanted to get at, that's one of the most important things. It's really hard to explain a place like Galveston in one book, but some of the things I wanted to touch on were the diversity of the people who live on it. I think that's something that's overlooked. If you look at, East Texas or coastal Texas or Texas as a whole, like for anyone who doesn't know it very well, the kind of breadth of diversity that is found there, like there's a huge immigrant population. There's people from across the border nearby in Mexico, and there's people from, across the oceans and continents. And that's how I experienced Galveston, as this really cool melting pot of, you'd walk down the street, you go to the grocery store and you'd hear like Vietnamese, or you'd hear Tagalog, or you would hear Spanish, like at any given moment. And I also really wanted to depict Hurricane Ike. I found that, so at the time that I was writing this, that was the worst hurricane that had hit that area. Now it's, it's still bad, but now Hurricane Harvey is significant too, especially for Houston. And largely kind of missed Galveston, which I found really interesting. That's not usually the case, but Ike was so significant to the island, and it really impacted like my family who lived there. And even though I was living hours away, I was living in Dallas at the time, and it impacted us too, because we had to host our families who evacuated, and then go back and look at their houses and things like that. So it just the struggle to rebuild took a long time, and it's still ongoing. In a lot of the neighborhoods, people just never came back. People couldn't afford to. So that felt really important to me, just to kind of depict in different ways. And it was only scratching the surface of what I think this place could do in a book. Yeah.
Well, it's so cool because the structure of it is a novel and stories. So essentially, they're all linked together towards a similar plot and similar concept, which is like perfect for that, for that place-based concept. And I found it really interesting because I've never been to Galveston, but I know of Galveston, and I don't know how or why, which is also for such a tiny place, and I love that that's something that like means that there's personality just waiting to be unearthed for a literary moment. So that's super cool. In terms of, since this is familiar to you and close to your heart in terms of a location, then how did this, or did it make it tricky? Like, what was tricky about writing something so familiar?
Oh my God, that's it's almost the most comforting thing, and it should be the easiest, but it's almost the trickiest. Like if that makes sense, because you want to do it justice,
Right.
you know it well, and I think the frustrating thing is that you never will. I mean, as hard as I try, if I write one book about Galveston, and not even every chapter in this book is in Galveston, right? There's a few places where I escape and I look at people before and after they arrive in Galveston somehow. It's impossible to do. I mean, I'll be able to capture aspects of it, hopefully, and people might recognize their Galveston like in some of these places, and then there's going to be other people who are like, well, that's nothing like my Galveston. Like you didn't touch on any of X, Y, and Z areas. And I know that to be true too, right? So that's the pressure and the burden of it. But I think once I was able to just sort of, once I leaned into that and acknowledged, like, hey, this isn't going to be the be all end all book of Galveston. And I hope it's not, like, I hope what that means is that there's just more books to be written that I wasn't the one to write. So that was the tricky part, but also like the freeing part once I got there and kind of took the pressure off myself and was like, all right, you don't have to represent every aspect of all of these places, that just means that there's room for more people to write their stories.
That makes perfect sense. I think more fiction writers need to hear that, actually, because it's still fiction too. I mean, it's still, it can't encompass everything. And to claim that it needs to be accurate is also like, that's a question for grad school students everywhere, right? Accuracy in fiction.
Yeah. And there's so many, like I've heard those stories too about fiction writers who will, like people will base their setting on a place, but then they'll change the name, right? Like, Americo Paredes has this famous book about Brownsville, Texas, but he changes it to Jonesville, right? So just so that he's not, so in a lot of ways, I think writers try to do that so they're not burdened with that, like, I need to capture it, I need to make it accurate. Whatever accurate means. But yeah, I mean, I thought about that, but I didn't want to do that. I was like, there's so few books out there that have us listed, have, name places like Galveston and Uvalde and Brownsville, that I wanted to put them in there, and the locals who will see it, if they want to come at me, that's fine too. We can all have that conversation. But I was like, nope, they're going in the book. We're naming them. I'm putting them in the book. They're going to belong on this in this book.
And I mean, the culture of coming at you too. I mean, if it's a hurricane at this time period and it makes landfall in 2008, like, there's no question of where this is. So then that just becomes, oh, you were trying to mask it. And then, and so that different relationship.
Exactly. You couldn't win. So I was like, well, if I'm gonna piss somebody off, then I'm gonna make it the real places.
I love it. Yeah. Just let it wash over you. That's a good way to be. I think more writers need to be that way. It's a scary thing.
I hope so.
All right. So Hurricane Ike, right? This is such a pivotal element of this, clearly, right? Like this is going to create, it's an interesting thing because you have the conflicts within their lives of the characters in this book, and then Hurricane Ike like twists it, right, to the next kind of level of conflict, which is so important. And of course, this is a natural step for the novel to take because I believe it actually made landfall on Galveston like during the night, right? Because I did a little bit of research just to make sure I would remember this. And a significant number of people didn't evacuate, so it was a big one.
Yes.
Okay, so when you think back to when you first wrote this, was it Ike itself, like having that happen, that inspired the novel, or was it the people there and then Ike was that twisting thing that made you think about it? Or was it something else?
It was the second. Yeah, absolutely. I already had the place in mind and the characters, I was working with and working towards. And I think, I rely on the craft techniques that I love reading in books too, where I was looking for some kind of external pressure and I didn't even need to invent it, right? Like, I think when I wrote this story, the first story, it was not long after Ike, maybe a year or two. And I was still thinking about Galveston in terms of like their rebuilding from that. And so it felt like a natural sort of pressure that and this, threat that could twist the characters and put them in these situations that they have to make these decisions. Like I think given my druthers, my characters would just like think about things really deeply and then just go around with their lives thinking about things forever. Like nothing would happen and they wouldn't make any decisions. So I kind of wanted to see what would happen. Like if I put these characters in the situation that was very real of what Ike did, how would certain ones react? And so then it was fun to kind of think about which characters would immediately pack up and bounce, right? Like, and which ones would want to tough it out and go nearby, as close inland as they could so they could get back quickly. Which ones wouldn't be able to, right? We know, mobility is a privilege in a lot of places and some people just couldn't leave or didn't. There were a lot of factors too about previous hurricanes that had hit in the area. And this was all post Katrina. So I think there was that threat as well. People were taking hurricanes more seriously, but then they would evacuate and we had things like gridlock on the interstates getting out of Houston. And, people were stuck for hours in this baking heat because of course, hurricane season's in summer when it's so hot here. So that a lot of external factors influenced like how many people left and stayed in Galveston. And I found that fascinating too. And I wanted to kind of portray, if not a breadth of people's experiences, then at least a small sample of what some people could do and what some couldn't. So that was definitely I had Ike on the brain almost immediately when I started writing this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I find it really fascinating that so much fiction is about inventing that conflict. And I find it really fascinating when someone doesn't invent it and applies the real life scenario. And I also find it fascinating that so much about our reactions to a disaster scenario shows so much about us, right?
Yeah.
Yes. It's a great way to get to the heart of a character and recognize it. And then if we think about the reflection of us, then it's like a great way to get to the heart of us. So yeah, there's so much here, Kim.
Yeah. Awesome. Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I think a lot of the characters in the book are doing, right? Like some of them are fighting these or going with these instincts that they have before a hurricane was coming of, I'm rooted to this place or I'm here now. What do I do? Where do I go? Can I stay here? Can I live here? Can I belong here? Or can I just pack my stuff and go, right? Like, what can I do? So all these instincts that they already had or now just have all this urgency from, okay, like this category 4 storm is coming, what do you do?
Yeah, and it makes so much sense too that, I mean, and that's, so much of fiction writing is controlling the conflict and recognizing what the conflict can do and creating scenarios. And like for these characters, the scenario of questioning yourself then comes in. And that's also what's really interesting, right? Because it becomes this moment of a self-awareness that we don't necessarily get all the time with conflict. But I mean, you have a hurricane coming, you see it on the news, you have to be like, what do I do and what does that mean? Which is interesting.
Yes. Yeah. You learn a lot about yourself, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
You really do, for better or for worse.
Well, structurally, moving off of this, what I love about this too is, because this is a novel and stories, we get different perspectives, we bounce from characters, and we also get, we have some first person, we have some third person, and then we have the third person plural in your first chapter, which I am a huge fan of. Yeah, ever since
Me too.
Yeah, it's such a fun one to write too.
So good. Yeah.
Yeah, so good. But then it feels good when you get it right, and then when you get it wrong, you're like, wait, who's speaking? What is it?
I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, exactly. Like, what did I do with this? It's going nowhere. It's not working.
So this is the first chapter of your, and this is when we meet Maharlika, an important character. Yeah. Yep. And she creates such a significant conflict in the work for other people as well.
She does.
So what's important about you? Why did you choose third person plural for her?
Oh man, so one of the things I really like about third person, I think we all sort of know that Greek chorus kind of aspect of it, right? Singing the song of someone else, honestly, it tends to be the case, right? Like, oh, Achilles, I'm going to misquote the Iliad, so I'm not going to do that. But, but the aspect of the mob mentality of a group, a gaggle of humans, if you will, who are looking at someone else, right? Like, and talking about someone else and thinking and processing about someone else. And when I was writing this chapter, which was originally a story where I was purposefully trying to imitate this voice, trying to use the third person plural, I almost didn't have to think about it. This is rare for my pieces, but when I thought, okay, third person plural, they're looking at someone, and I was already kind of in the mindset of this link, the time it was linked collection of stories. I was like, oh my God, it's these ladies looking at Maharlika. Like, Maharlika at that point had been a character I was writing around in a lot of ways, and I think I still am in this story. But I knew she was going to be important, and I just instantly thought of of this particular festival that I've gone to like every year since I was 4 years old, in Galveston, or it used to be in Galveston, and it's exactly what I hope comes across in the story, in the chapter, which is this big cultural festival. It's religious, but it was this opportunity where all of the Filipinos in the area and Galveston just kind of get clumped together, and there was a lot of Tagalog spoken, there's a lot of food, there's dancing, there's karaoke. Like, it was a good time, but it was this, like, the way I would describe it to all my friends back in Uvalde who weren't Filipino was like, it's the Filipino festival, and they were like, okay. But the kind of group of the women elders, right? Like the aunties, or however you want to describe them. Like, in my mind, they're the titas, which is aunt. And them looking at this outsider, right? Like, them thinking about someone who was part of them and isn't one of them right now. Like, that felt so clear to me, and resonant, that I was just like, I almost didn't, it just like kind of flowed out. Like, I just immediately started writing. And I could hear the voices and the way that they kind of regard Maharlika and the choices she's made to not be one of them, right? Like, it's so judgy, and but also there's this like sense of hurt and this sense of longing, and this group of women who've gathered together because they're, strangers in a strange land, like this immigration has united them, and now they find themselves in Galveston, Texas, of all places, and what happens when someone decides they don't want to be part of that and shows up anyway and is kind of throwing their conventions back in their face in a lot of different ways. That just really struck me. And third person allows you to do that, right? Like, there's almost an immediate outsider mentality, like us versus them, we versus you. And I just, am grateful to the voice for doing that. So much of the work, but it worked really well as soon as I kind of had like the restrictions and the kind of structure nailed. And I knew who was going to be speaking.
Right. Well, I was so glad that it started us off because it created that Galveston culture immediately as well, right? Or that culture of that melting pot that you referenced, but also a melting pot also has its side groups, right? And so it's nice to see like the coming together and the spreading apart, and then the how that affects each story. And it's almost like when you read this thing, it's like watching Mercury move, right? That coming together and spreading apart as you go through the population.
I love that, Jesse. I'm going to steal that. Yeah, that's
you
awesome.
Go for it. Mercurial. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I really wanted to draw attention to that because I thought that was such a great kickoff for the novel. And by the way, the novel ends in such a creative way too. And I'm not even going to touch on it because I want the readers to go that way. Because I was yes,
it was a curveball. Like,
it's definitely a curveball.
I wasn't sure how it was going to play out, but it, every step of the way, like people let me keep doing it. And I was like, all right, it's there.
That's when you've reached a certain level of writer heaven, is when you're just like, yeah, go for it. Let your last chapter just be what you want it to be.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's always really important to mess with structure and play with it and recognize the power of that. And so I always want to draw attention to it. So let's talk about dialogue next. And this is, since we are talking about writing and the process of writing and all that, I was in love with dialogue in this novel, and mainly because I didn't notice it, for the lack of a better way of explaining that, right?
Oh no, that's the best compliment, right? Exactly. Isn't it? When it comes to dialogue, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And it's just like you just go with it, and it's just in your the television that's in your brain, as I say to my students, like you just fold right in and you accept it. And so I want to talk about that. So what is your method for meticulous writing here? Because I think that's really what this requires.
Yeah, thank you.
How did you approach that?
Yeah, oh God, it does not come easily. I feel like I say that to my students too, like when they struggle with things like dialogue, maybe for some writers it's natural. It's not natural for me. So I do work hard on it. I think my intention always is to, you make it sound realistic. I think more than even information being conveyed, like there's that thing that you're trying to do with dialogue is convey certain information that in just a different way than you would in like summary, or just straight up prose. But second to, I want this conversation to sound right. I want the language to sound right. And I almost try to use it as like more of a character or a setting technique, than a plot, like to further the plot. I want it to be, by the way Maharlika speaks, or the way Carly speaks, or the way Jess speaks, I want the reader to kind of learn a little bit more about them, and to make them feel a little bit more real. And so I work hard on that. I think I'd say my first round of dialogue is usually a little too much. Like I think I'm trying a little too hard. That's just true of my writing. I think I'm trying a little too hard. And the second stage is so important because that's where I'm like, all right, okay, cut that. That's corny. Like second stage me is always a much better writer. But first draft me is just trying to get the stuff on the page. So the dialogue is always a little too much. I think I put a little too much, maybe too many colloquialisms, or like too much emphasis on like people's accents, or what have you. But one of the best pieces of advice, and I don't even remember who told me this, I'm sure multiple people have said it who are better minds than me, but is that you want to trust the reader. The reader honestly doesn't need as much as you think they do. Like we all move through the world speaking, having conversations, communicating with others, and you can pare down to the bare minimum and the reader will still understand what you're doing, right? Like, so not necessarily trying too hard to imitate, but allowing yourself to feel more honest. If I don't even know if that makes sense, but once I kind of heard that, I sort of just trusted my dialogue a bit more. I didn't feel the need to, like, for example, I was doing the thing and early in my writing to kind of emphasize the way people sounded, like to the ear, how they sounded. And so I would like drop G's, or I would, put like a bunch more Spanish or Tagalog or whatever they're switching in between, whatever language, in. And, honestly, you often just need some small doses of it, right? Like small dashes. So that's usually second stage me again, but I find that remembering that is really important, because once I see what I want to convey and the sentence and what they're trying to say, I realize I can do that with much less wording, if that
makes perfect sense. I mean, I think there's a danger in how we're taught that. Actually, I think that there's so much emphasis on dialogue and so much go out into the world and write down what somebody's saying, come back, and and it's like, and actually that's not, we're not writing the real world with fiction, so there's still that, again, television in the brain, still that translation method. So that makes perfect sense. Okay. So speaking of readers and how they take it in, we talk about the Karankawas, and so this is a reference in the text. There's a character whose grandmother told her she's a distant relative of this indigenous group. And I've never come across this group before. It's out of southern Texas and Mexico region, right?
Yep.
Okay. So why, that is the title of the book and the title of the chapter in which this comes into play. So why did you choose that chapter for your title? What was the focus?
So the focus was always, I mean, at the time when it was a linked story collection, that was the first story I ever wrote, the title story. And everything sort of stemmed from that, just because I had the main character's name is Carly. I had Carly on the brain. She was such a rich character in that first story that I wrote, which has changed significantly. Now it's in the book in a couple of different pieces, but the heart of it is the same in the title chapter. And I found her kind of push and pull dilemma of wanting to belong to a place, but also being kind of pressured by belonging to a place and a people, really, like just fascinating to me. And I wanted to dive into that a bit more. And the Karankawas, yes, I was always taught were being past tense, were the indigenous group of the Texas coast, one of several, but like the main one on the coast. They were nomadic, and it's the sort of thing that like we as Texans in public school, we learn about like for a day in Texas history, and then they were always talked about as having vanished. Like the discussion was always around they're extinct. How did they go extinct? Who knows, right? Like there were these stories and conversations about how some people believe they migrated and joined up with other groups who have lasted for longer and are recognized now, or they died out by the conquistadors, or they were wiped out by disease, or who knows. Like there was always just this end discussion of and then they're gone, right? And I, as a kid, I was in 7th grade and I was learning Texas history, and I was born in Galveston. I had this family there. I just found that fascinating. I was so interested in the mystery of it, and the potential of like what could happen and what could have happened, and the fact that they were rooted in this place that I knew and loved just added to it. It was just, again, it's one layer of this like really like amazing, detailed, like layered history in Galveston. And it was just another one to kind of think about its indigenous beginnings with the very first people. And but the thing that I find fascinating too is this is something that I also knew growing up, is that there are people who claim to be descendants of the Karankawas. And there was actually a really recent, I think it came out this month, article in Texas Highways magazine that interviews people who are descendants and have known their whole lives that they were descendants, and are fighting to get that recognition of like, I think the title of the article is "We're Still Here." Like we're here. And it was because of their whole lives. It's been around this narrative of like, you're not here. And they were like, excuse me. Yeah, we are. So I like, I wish I'd read that article before I'd written this, but I liked the idea of this notion of history being passed down, which is something that, gets experienced in like my father's family or my mother's family, like in the experience that of it, which is this idea of, what happens if your history is not recorded, right? Like what happens if you don't have ancestry.com to look back at your detailed like lineage? These are things that have been passed down through oral history, or merely traditions, or just belief in a lot of ways. And I loved the idea that someone like Carly's grandmother, Magdalena, has this firm belief in her history, and that Carly is like, but wait, like maybe it's not our history. Can we say this? What does it mean? What does it even matter? And I'd like to think that the book doesn't make it an easy question. Like I think it asks the reader to kind of decide for themselves, as much as I as a reader hate hearing that, but like kind of decide for yourself, where you stand, where the characters stand, like what does history mean when it's conveyed through like legend, right? Or narrative. And it comes down to like who decides history, right? Who decides what that is.
It feels like a throwback to almost like a Toni Morrison approach, Song of Solomon approach, right? In terms of that history and how it's approached.
Yeah, thank you. Wow.
Through. Yeah, you get to write that one down to Toni Morrison.
Like
magic.
My God.
It's a question.
I'm gonna steal all of these. You're like, Jesse thought I was
yeah,
like
there you
Toni
go.
Morrison.
It's a question of how stories are passed on and how stories that are outside of the realm of what we, have recorded in, our traditional, almost academic sense, right? Outside of that.
Yeah.
And it's so important. And I think that's really, I have to jump to our next question because I'm sad because we're running out of time, but I want people to see that as a framework too, for the whole novel. I think that's really important too, in terms of that story. Yeah. And what we don't hear about hurricanes and what is washed over literally and figuratively, obviously,
yep.
When we're talking about this, right? And that's something that's so important. And coming back to that hurricane effect, right? You have that line, water rising, still rising, a very important point here in the novel. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to focus on this is because I knew that you write environmentally focused stuff, or at least place-based stuff that happens to then, of course, involve the environment as it does. And there's something very important here that you've done by drawing attention to the vulnerable people in the path of storms like Ike. So that's tricky too, though, right? So how did writing about the environment's true issues complicate your fiction writing? Or did it just make sense to do it? Was it the part that just filled itself in?
I think it's a little of both, honestly. Like it felt natural because it is part of everyday life. Like this isn't, climate change when it impacts, for example, like the Texas coast or the Gulf Coast or wherever, and we start seeing more and more powerful hurricanes every year, like much more destructive Cat 4s, Cat 5s, like you just see them constantly. That's impossible to escape if you live there, right? Like you're constantly preparing, you're constantly boarding up, you're evacuating, you're repairing, whatever you're doing, you're trying to survive. So it really is impossible to kind of write about a place like this and not show the impacts of something like climate change, right? Like just in the very minutia of their life. Well, everybody has to make sure they've got cases of water, right. Everybody's got to have their hurricane go bag. They've got to have full tanks of gas in their car at any time, because at any minute you could be asked to drive away or, get stuck in 5-hour gridlock on the interstate trying to escape, if you're lucky, right? And so that felt impossible. But also I think the tricky part is, again, doing it justice. Like I think I never want to be, to feel like I've got an agenda in the work, right? And because that just feels unnatural. I think in a lot of ways I most likely do, but I'm not trying to convey that in the stories. Instead, I think it just comes down to the human aspect. And that's what I was really trying to get at. Like, look at the devastation of this, and something I think about right now, especially that we're in summer, which is always troublesome for Texas. And like, I'm from Southwest Texas, which is currently going through this major drought. And every day people pray for rain and watch the weather incessantly and wish for hurricanes, honestly, because that's the only way that this region of Texas will get rain, is if there's some kind of tropical depression. And then everybody on the coast is like, well, shit, no, I don't want that. So it's this really, it's impossible to escape. It's just part of everyday life. But it, of course, if you bear down and like expand and think about it, it is rooted in these big things, these big problems. And I think rather than touching on the big problems, which better minds than me can break down. There's scientists out there, there's journalists, there's people who are writing these big questions and issues. And I think my strength lies in the little people. That sounds terrible, but the people who are on the ground dealing with it day in and day out, right? Like, how many times can these places go through this, right? At any given moment, I think there's always articles during hurricane season about like Houston and Galveston can't take another hurricane. They'll just be washed out. Like there's always something about that. What will we do in the future to prevent this? And, just to make everyday life a little less threatening, if that's even possible. So that's where I landed with the book, is to kind of look at that in a close range.
Well, and that makes perfect sense. I think the close range is what we need and what we're missing, to be honest. We have these big statements, we have the statistics, and then we have the people interpreting the statistics, who are commonly separate from the environment itself, right? So it's such a bizarre thing. And then there's also this voice of people who can't recognize that there's a change at all, just in their day-to-day lives. And so it's so helpful to just present that. And I find it interesting you brought in the idea of writing with an agenda, but is it an agenda if it is actually what's happening, right?
No,
so that's such an interesting,
it's depicting the
right,
normal.
It's just how it is. So I especially since I think with my writing, I've written about hurricanes in the past, and mine was commonly, they were not centralized around an actual hurricane. It was a one that I created, and that was such a problematic thing because it was considered to be dystopian. But this isn't.
But
the potential.
It's not.
So it's only dystopian if you don't know the effect of hurricanes. So I find this really fascinating, and I'm so glad that you did zero in on Hurricane Ike and you gave us that window. So
thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, for talking with me. This is excellent. I am so excited to see where your book goes, and I feel so lucky I got to read it early. So
thank you.
Pre-order Kim's book. Yes, there we go.
The beautiful cover that they designed.
It is gorgeous.
Yes, it's awesome.
Yes.
This has been. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking back there. It's like he's outside and barking.
Don't worry about it.
This was the best. Thank you so much for having me, for reading, for all the great conversation. Yeah, this was awesome.
No problem, Kim. It's awesome to have you. I would love to have you for your next work too. So for those of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining us. This has been The Narrative Impact of a Famous Storm, an interview with novelist Kim Garza. We're so pleased you spent this time with us, and we hope the discussion has been valuable. Please be sure to check out 1455 Literary Arts at 1455litarts.org to learn more about stuff that's coming up, the rest of the festival. We've got an in-person day this year, which is really exciting. So just make sure you give us lots of feedback and enjoy your different presentations. Thank you, Kim.